Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. The National Ranching Heritage Center on the campus of Texas Tech University tells the story of ranching in the American West through over 50 historic structures. One of these structures is the King Ranch shipping pens. A portion of the Caesars pens from the King Ranch, once the largest cattle shipping enclosures in the world, was given to the National Ranching Heritage Center to be a part of the railroad complex. A historical marker was placed at the original spot of the Caesars pens near Kingsville in South Texas, dating them to the early 1900s and reflecting the name of Caesar Clayberg, rancher and wildlife promoter, born on September 20th, 1873 in Cuero, Texas. He moved to the King Ranch in 1900 to begin work as the chief assistant to his uncle, Robert Clayberg. A King Ranch four-man crew brought 2 trucks carrying gates, posts, and steps from the famous pens, which were taken down when the ranch's cattle were no longer shipped long distances. Building plans were obtained from the Santa Fe Railroad for the smallest set of pens, and these were donated to the National Ranching Heritage Center. The most active period for the pens was the 1920s through the 1970s. You can see the King Ranch shipping pens in person at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. You can check them out online at ranchingheritage.org. Come experience real ranches, real stories, real heritage at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. In the 1870s, a copper engraver from England named Frank Dupre came to Texas and spent 3 years on a cattle ranch. Afterward, he returned to England, where he became a theater critic in London and wrote what were called curtain raisers. In the 1880s, his poem, Lasca, was published in the Montana Stock Growers Journal, and it quickly entered the oral tradition of cowboy poetry. It became so popular that in 1919, an Ohio newspaper said that there is scarcely an American who has not read the poem, recited it, or committed it to memory. And in 1951, a writer named Mabel Major said that if you want to tell a native Texan from a refugee from the United States, that is, if he is over 50, just ask him if he knows Lasca. Here's Lasca by Frank Dupre. It's all very well to write reviews, to carry umbrellas and keep dry shoes, to say what everyone is saying here, and to wear what everyone else must wear. But tonight, I'm sick of the whole affair. I want free life and I want fresh air. And I sigh for the canner after the cattle, the crack of the whips like shots in battle, the melee of hooves and horns and heads that wars and wrangles and scatters and spreads. The green beneath, and the blue above, and dash and danger, and life and love, and Lasca. Lasca used to ride on a mouse-gray Mustang close by my side, in blue serape and bright-belled spur. I laughed with joy as I looked at her. Little knew she of books or creeds, and Ave Maria sufficed her needs. And little she cared save to be at my side, to ride with me and ever to ride from San Saba's shore to Lavaca's tide. She was as bold as the billows that beat, and she was as free as the breezes that blow. From her little head to her little feet she was swayed in her suppleness to and fro by each gust of passion. A sapling pine that grows on the edge of a Kansas bluff and wars with the wind when the weather is rough is like this Lasca, this love of mine. She would hunger that I might eat, would take the bitter and leave me the sweet, but once when I made her jealous for fun by something I looked at or said or done, one Sunday in San Antonio to a glorious girl at the Alamo, she drew from her garter a little dagger Sting of the wasp, it made me stagger, an inch to the left or an inch to the right, and I wouldn't be maundering here tonight. But she sobbed, and sobbing so swiftly bound her torn rebozo about the wound that I quickly forgave her. Scratches don't count in Texas, down by the Rio Grande. Her eye was brown, a deep, deep brown. Her hair was darker than her eye, and something in her smile and frown, curled crimson lip and instep high, showed that there ran in each blue vein, mixed with the milder Aztec strain, the vigorous vintage of old Spain. She was alive in every limb, with feeling to the fingertips. And when the sun is like a fire, and the sky one shimmering soft sapphire, one does not drink in little sips. So why did I leave the fresh and free that suited her and suited me? Listen a while, and you will see. But this to be sure, in earth or air, God and God's laws are everywhere, and Nemesis comes with a foot as fleet on the Texas trail as on Regent Street. The air was heavy. The night was hot. I sat by her side and forgot the herd that was taking their rest, forgot that the air was close, oppressed, that the Texas norther comes sudden and soon, in the dead of the night or the blaze of the noon, that once let the herd on their breath take fright, then nothing on earth can stop their flight. And woe to the rider, and woe to the steed who falls in front of their mad stampede. Was that thunder? No, by the Lord. I sprang to my saddle without a word, one foot on mine, and she clung behind, away on a hot chase down the wind, and never was fox hunt half so hard, and never was steed so little spared, for we rode for our lives. You shall hear how we fared in Texas, down by the Rio Grande. The Mustang flew when we urged him on. There was one chance left, and you have but one. Halt, jump to the ground, shoot your horse, crouch under his carcass, and take your chance. And if the steers in their frantic course don't batter you both to pieces at once, you may thank your star. If not, then it's goodbye to the quickening kiss and the long-drawn sigh and the open air and the open sky in Texas, down by the Rio Grande. Well, the cattle gained on us, and just as I felt from my old six-shooter behind in my belt, down came the Mustang, and down came we, clinging together. And what was the rest? A body that spread itself over my breast, 2 arms that shielded my dizzy head, 2 lips that hard on my lips were pressed. And then came thunder into my ears as over us surged a sea of steers, blows that beat blood into my eyes. And when I could rise, Laska was dead. I gouged out a grave a few feet deep, and there in the earth's arms I lay her to sleep. And there she is lying, and no one knows. And the summer shines and the winter snows, and for many a day the flowers have spread a pall of petals over her head. And the little gray hawk hangs aloft in the air, and the sly coyote trots here and there. And the black snake glides and glitters and slides into the rift of a cottonwood tree. And the buzzard sails on, and comes and is gone, stately and still, like a ship at sea. And I wonder why I do not care for the things that are, like the things that were. Does half my heart lie buried there in Texas, down by the Rio Grande? Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Bob Canaan. Bob Canaan is the resident historian of the King Ranch. If you haven't already, I'd recommend listening to the first part of this interview with Bob on the last episode of the podcast. On this second part of our interview, Bob talks about the history of the King Ranch after the Civil War and also discusses the life and legacy of National Ranching Heritage Center Golden Spur recipient Helen Clayberg Groves. Here's Bob Canaan.
So King, at the end of the Civil War, he eventually became the sole proprietor of Santa Gertrudis Ranch. At the end of the war, King's Rancho, the Santa Gertrudis Ranch, comprised about 145,000 acres. King put it in high gear and went into business. Obviously, a lot of wild cattle had drifted into South Texas during the war that had been abandoned, and a lot of them were on King's ranches. King had good lawyers. He was buying a lot of land. As a matter of fact, between 1868, when he really became the sole proprietor of Santa Gertrudis, and his death in 1885, he bought 60 different tracts of land, put together the ranch as it encompassed 614,000 acres at the time of his death in 1885. The story between 1868 and 1865 goes everywhere from the inception of the Running W brand, which he registered in 1869. He had been using it since 1860, but he registered it. And he really registered it because that's when he started to drive cattle up north to Kansas with his Kansas men. Whole nother story, part 2 or 3 or 4, just talking about the years between 1869 and 1884 when Captain King drove 100,000 head of King Ranch cattle to railheads in St. Louis, Nebraska, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Abilene, and Wichita, Kansas. He was one of the most prolific drovers of the time, and they were all his cattle. He wasn't a contractor. He drove all his cattle. During the same time as he was expanding the ranch, he was digging a deep port in Corpus Christi and building a wharf there. He built a railroad from Corpus Christi to Laredo called the Tex-Mex Railroad. He put together a stagecoach line that ran from Corpus Christi to Brownsville. He built the first ice house. He owned 3 hide and tallow plants. He owned the newspaper in Corpus Christi. He raised a family of 5. He traveled all around the United States, buying good horses and good cattle to try to breed up those long-horned Mexican cattle that had been left in the country, and started defense of Santa Gertrudis. Captain King was a great believer in private property. He wasn't one of these open range guys. When he bought land, he wanted to fence it, and he did. He and Mifflin Kennedy both. Kennedy had the Laurelus and the La Parra. King had the Santa Gertrudis and all of that country west of there. They started in 1868, 69 fencing off their properties. They fenced it off originally with 1x6, 20-foot cypress planks, 3-board. The entire land grant of Santa Gertrudis was board fenced by 1869. He wanted to protect his land. He said that I wanted to protect it because I wanted to upgrade my cattle herd, and I couldn't upgrade my cattle herd, and I couldn't control the wild horses unless I fenced my property. But also, he wanted to keep the squatters away because the squatters were coming in, and he did that, and he did it with a small army that he kept employed that helped protect the land. So there was so much going on between 68 to his death in 85. That, Andy, we could talk for 3 hours, but suffice it to say, he died in April of 1885. He worked, and when I talk, we don't know what work is. The pace that he kept for his life, working, traveling. He had just returned from Kansas in 1884, in December of 1884, and he was putting together a deal in Corpus Christi, and he was so sick with cancer, stomach cancer, that he couldn't go on anymore. Went back to the ranch. The family, Robert Clayberg, who by that time had married the youngest daughter, Alice King, and they married and they were engaged. I'm sorry, they didn't marry until after Captain King died, but they were engaged to be married, and Robert Clayberg was managing Captain King's affairs as his lawyer. Clayberg and Mrs. King convinced Captain King to go to San Antonio and see the doctor because he was so sick. So they loaded him on a wagon and took him on a 3-day trip to San Antonio. He checked into the Menger Hotel in San Antonio where they would stay when they were there. And a doctor by the name of Ferdinand Herff, who's a well-known Texan, a doctor, was his doctor, came to see him, as well as two specialists from New Orleans that Mifflin Kennedy had retained to see, and they diagnosed him with stomach cancer and said he would die. So at that time and that time only, Captain King sat down with Robert Clayberg and wrote his last will and testament. And he died 2 weeks later in the Menger Hotel, buried in San Antonio. His entire family and Robert Clayberg and Mifflin Kennedy, who had lost his wife, Petrovella, just a little over a month before, were all at his bedside. So they went back to Santa Gertrudis after they buried him, and Mrs. King appointed Robert Clayberg as the manager of the ranch, and they started to put together how they were going to pay off the debt that they had on 614,000 acres of land that Captain King had been buying. Captain King had a lot of money, but he had a line of credit that was incredible, and he used it to buy everything that he could and anything that he could. He was a voracious buyer of land. Robert E. Lee told him, his credo, buy land and never sell. That's what Robert E. Lee told him, and that was his lifelong motto. So Robert Clayberg took over the management of the ranch for Mrs. King, married Alice King in 1886, and they had 5 children through that generation. The Clayberg children included Mr. Bob Clayberg, who was Helen Grove's father, Dick Clayberg, who was T.O. Clayberg's grandfather. I say it was T.O.'s grandfather, and he was a congressman, and 3 sisters, Alice Clayberg East, Henrietta Rosa Clayberg, who married Tom Armstrong, and Sarah Spawn Clayberg, who is the mother of Bobby Shelton and B.K. Johnson, which are names that your ranching friends will all know from South Texas. So that Clayberg era of ranching commenced and really went into high gear, really with lots of fencing, lots of improvements, and a continuation of buying land. Until the early part of the 20th century, and by 1910, King Ranch consisted of about 1,250,000 acres in South Texas. They had a cow herd of over 100,000 head. Believe it or not, predominantly Hereford cattle. Robert Clayberg loved Hereford cattle, so he started buying Hereford bulls and breeding up breed them to those old Durham cows and shorthorn cows that Captain King had, and they ended up with a lot of white-faced cattle that didn't do so good down in South Texas. Kind of the reason that the Santa Gertrudis came about was because those Hereford cattle kind of fell apart down in that hot country and didn't do quite as well as those Durhams did. In 1910, during that era, Tom O'Connor, another iconic rancher in South Texas, gave the Claybergs a half Shorthorn, half Brahma bull, and they threw him out with about 50 of their Durham cows, and they sure liked what they saw out of that. So a few years later, by that time Bob Clayberg was coming into the picture and helping his father manage the ranch. They bought 50 head of Brahma bulls from A.P. Borden, turned those 50 bulls out on 2,500 shorthorn cows, and that's where they started to develop the Santa Gertrudis. The foundation bull of the Santa Gertrudis herd was Monkey, that was born in 1920, born to a 1/16 Brahma mostly shorthorn milk cow that they had in a pen that one of the Quinanios was using for house milk, and they threw one of those bulls, and Dick Clayberg was managing, Congressman Clayberg, Dick Teo's grandfather, was managing the Laurellis division at that time. He called Bob Clayberg, who was running the show, and he said, "Come on down here to the headquarters. I want you to see this bull. I think he's the one we've been looking for." Bob Clayberg came down and saw Monkey, and he said, "This is the one we needed. This is the confirmation. This is what we want to do." So they started their breeding program by inbreeding and line breeding those daughters and granddaughters of Monkey, and back and forth, and eventually by 1940 Santa Gertrudis became the first American breed that would be recognized by the USDA in the United States. Came from that old Monkey bull. But the Bob Clayberg who came in to run the ranch after Robert Clayberg Sr. had a stroke in the late teens. Bob Clayberg had been away to college for a little while, had been in college in Wisconsin, and had some agricultural schooling. But he had a scientific mind. He was an innovator. He was from the same ilk as Captain King and Robert Clayberg. They were, they created things. They had a scientific mind, and he was a breeder. As we know with the Santa Gertrudis, and as we know with the quarter horses, and as we know with the thoroughbred horses, those were all improved and bred up and produced through Bob Clayberg's ingenuity and hiring great men and geneticists and such through the years that would perfect those things. But again, those years, those inventive years, the end of Mrs. King's life in 1925. The end of Robert Clayberg's life in 1933. Bob Clayberg taking over the ranches as the general manager and the trustee with his brother Dick of Mrs. King's estate. They were ranchers. They leased the ranch to Humble Oil in 1933. And the reason that they leased the ranch to Humble Oil was so they could get some upfront money that could pay Mrs. King's estate taxes. Mrs. King died in 1925 with a provision that the estate would not be probated for 10 years, and that gave the family the opportunity to keep the ranch together. It was always their intention to hold the ranch together. They were in their third and fourth generations by that time. So they kept it together. Robert Clayberg, Bob Clayberg, Dick Clayberg started to buy out some of the grandchildren of the other children. And I'm jumped around so much that you've missed so much. I mean, it's hard to put it all together unless you know the intricate details of that. But anyway, just jumping forward to the Bob Clayberg years. Bob Clayberg managed King Ranch for 50 years. He was president of King Ranch and the general manager. Again, worked to develop the Santa Gertrudis breed, through buying a horse from George Clegg in Alice, Texas, that came to be known Old Sorrel from a band of that was out of one of George Clegg's wax stalls. People, your friends would know when we talk about the history of the quarter horses in South Texas, but bought that Old Sorrel horse that Bob Clayberg and Dick Clayberg both, and Dick Clayberg, Congressman Clayberg, Dick Teo's grandfather, was all just the same kind of horseman and ranchman and cowman as Bob Clayberg was. That Old Sorrel, both of them said, was the best horse they ever saw on King Ranch. Even through the years, even after they bred in those sons and they had Solis and Tino and Pepe and all those horses that came at Macanudo, all those great horses, and Wimpy, number one registered in the Quarter Horse Association in 1941. That's another story. They had to go into the remuda and pick out the best stud horse because they had decided that the horse and mule program would become the Quarter Horse Association. So they had the ranchers all bring their best studs to Fort Worth, and they were going to be judged. And the winner of the contest would be the number one in the book of registry for the Quarter Horse Association. So King Ranch had a dilemma. They didn't know whether to take Pepe or Wimpy. They decided to take Wimpy, and Wimpy won. Pepe went on to win more and we're not talking about Little Pepe or Mr. Sand Pepe. We're talking about the original Pepe that was out of Old Sorrel. So that was again Bob Clayberg's legacy, the family's legacy of that. Helen Groves was Bob and Helen Clayberg's only daughter. She was born in 1927, I believe. Born in San Antonio. They lived on the ranch, but she was born in San Antonio, moved to the ranch, raised on the ranch with the Quineños, raised by Bob and Helen. Helen homeschooled her at the ranch, in the Quineños, and Caesar Clayberg taught her the ranch life, and she was in love with it. She hunted, she rode. Tom East gave her first horse when she was like 3 or 4 years old. Little old dun horse that they gave her. No, it wasn't. It was a little pinto horse that they gave her. You know, she rode that thing around and took it up and put it in the stable with the rest of the quarter horses back up in where the thoroughbred barns were and such. And you know, she just had the life on the ranch. Helen Campbell Clayberg, Bob Clayberg's wife, her family was from Kansas. They were also politicians, well done, and she was refined. Had gone to school in the East, but she loved King Ranch and fell right into it. So Helenita was raised on the ranch, raised with her cousins on the ranch, with the East boys, with Bobby Shelton and BK, with the Clayberg children. It was a family playland. I mean, they were with the Corrida. They were out at roundups. They were homeschooled. Helenita stayed on the ranch until she would have been probably what would be in junior high, and her mom wanted her to go back east to school, so she went to Foxcroft in a boarding school. Kind of had learned a refined education. Of course, Bob Clayberg sent a horse up there. She sent an old sorrel gelding up there for her so she could, because they did a lot of fox hunting up there. They were all jumpers, and so he sent a son old sorrel up there for her to use for her fox hunting up there, and went to Vassar College. It was interesting, you know, because about the time after Helenita went off to school, and you know, her family could listen to this and fill in all the blanks. Helenita put together a wonderful book of her life and story and family that's been published, and it's a great book in reference to her life and a lot of the history of King Ranch. But Bob and Helen Clayberg, life on King Ranch. And she really wrote it as an educational tool for her grandchildren, so they know something about their grandfather and about their great-grandfather and about King Ranch and the family and her father. But when she was away at college, her mother was awfully sick and had heart conditions and migraine headaches, lots of problems. So Bob Clayberg was going back east because they were running thoroughbred horses then. They had a stable full of thoroughbreds, and she was back east. So she would travel with Bob Clayberg to Saratoga, and she was with him. She was with Bob Clayberg. She was at his side for the Triple Crown of Assault in 1946. She was there. She was in the winner's circle with him instead of Helen because she wasn't able to go to a lot of those races. So you know, she was such a mentor to me from a historical standpoint because she was on the ranch a lot. Spent more time at Norris than she did at Santa Gertrudis, but she still maintained her father and mother's house at Santa Gertrudis right by the main house. She and the family also leased the Norris main house, and they used that as their compound. When she would come to the ranch, she would come and entertain guests and friends, but I'd always be able to catch her at a time that she'd be up by herself. Whenever I knew she was going to come to breakfast and she was going to be by herself, I'd go in and sit down and have coffee with her. And it was kind of like this conversation here. It could go on for about 5 or 6 hours. That's the way it ended up. We'd sit down and have a cup of coffee, and that 30-minute breakfast would go on for about 4 or 5 hours of her just talking about the people she knew. She had up until she died, she had such an incredible recall of history and of horses and cattle and Quineños and family members And everything about King Ranch, she loved her family. She loved the ranch. King Ranch had their saddle shop and started to promote the brand, like a lot of ranches are doing now. I've got a coat over here that has Running W on it. I always remember a story that I was told by somebody who was with her. She was going through the airport one time, and somebody was wearing a King Ranch saddle shop shirt, had the Running W on it, and she said, why is that man wearing my brand? So, she was of a generation that it was her ranch. It was her family's ranch. And she treated it that way. She respected her family. She respected her cousins so much. She was truly such an inspiration to all the family members, because she lived at a time that there wasn't an eighth generation, but there were 7 generations. We did a lot to try to, obviously like ranch happened, we don't have a lot of family members that still live in Kingsville. They've moved off. So we tried very hard to keep the family members engaged with King Ranch and immerse them in our history. And Helen needed to embrace that. Was always wanted to educate and teach the family their history about their family. She was she was a great lady to friends, to the cattle industry, to the quarter horse industry, to the thoroughbred industry, to stewardship of the land. You can't. There's nothing that involves modern ranching. She could easily go down in history as truly, and I've even heard her called the grande dame of the cattle industry. Well, she was. She'd walk into a room and never a stranger be there. And generally, she'd get in conversation with them that she would know 6 or 7 people that they knew, and it would just go into this, this incredible reunion. She'd never come to the ranch that she didn't go and visit the old Quineños that had been there working for her daddy that she grew up with. She was there for their funerals. She'd come to the main house, and I also managed the main house for years, and she'd come in, and we had the old Quineño cook. She'd go in that kitchen and sit down with them, and they'd start speaking Spanish and talking about the old days. It was just, we were fortunate that we did 2 or 3 oral interviews with Helenita, but you think it'd be hard for us to have a stopping place? It was impossible. It was like we were on the 10-yard line of a 100-yard football field. You could never get there because there was just so much going on, as our history is. The greatest thing about my life on King Ranch was getting to know the family and working for them and working with the people on the ranch, learning their history and being trusted to tell their history and to help pass that history on to other people. They live it. They love it. They're not egotistic about it. They come very natural by it. I always say, somebody will say, well, what about those family members? Oh, they're running around. I said, they don't wear that brand on their sleeve. You wouldn't know who they are. I mean, they're down there with the Cowboys. They're there. I mean, it's changed. The family's changed, obviously, because they've moved away from the ranch and they're not in the operations, but they've entrusted outsiders to take care of their business for them. Doesn't mean they don't have the passion, because they do, and they instilled that passion in me, and trusted me with their passion, and so that's a great thing. But can't find a stopping place, Andy. There's just too much to tell about about so many things in the first 30 years when Captain King was there, the next 30 years when Robert Clayberg Sr. was there, the next 50 years when Bob Clayberg was there, the T.O. Clayberg years, the outsider years. There's not a stopping place, and there shouldn't be, because I always tell people that King Ranch's history is as much about the future as it is about the past. And if we think that way, then that legacy ranch won't go away like so many of these legacy ranches have. That's the important thing. Know your history, appreciate your history, live that history, take care of your land that you've been entrusted with, pass it on to succeeding generations. That's what each of the 8 generations have done. They've passed it on. They owned it just for a little while, but it's a great place. Great place. I love it.
Are there resources or books you might direct me and my listeners to who might want to dig deeper into the King Ranch history?
Yeah, fortunately, King Ranch. There's quite a bibliography of King Ranch books that have been written, but I'm gonna focus on a few, starting with Tom Lee's 2-volume The King Ranch, which was written for the 100th anniversary of King Ranch. In 1953, and was not published until 1957. It's still a book that Tom Lee got it. It took him 5 years to write that book. Bob Clayberg hired him to write a pamphlet, and he ended up researching and writing a book that reads like a novel, reads like fiction, but it's true. King Ranch's history reads like fiction. It reads like what you see on TV now, but it's not. It's no old Western movie, and it's no Yellowstone. It's the real thing. So Tom Lee's book is a great place to start. Talked about Helenita's book, Bob and Helen Clayberg, their life on King Ranch. Janelle, T.O. Clayberg's wife, Janelle, a Texas Tech graduate who was a partner in his management of King Ranch from 1977 until T.O. retired from management in 1998. She took incredible photographs, was an incredible photographer, and took photographs on all the foreign divisions as well as the 4 divisions of the South Texas ranches, and wrote a book called Crying for Daylight. Wonderful, wonderful book. The reason that I'm at the Ranching Heritage Center right now is for an art talk and a book signing of a book that I just helped develop that's called King Ranch: A Legacy in Art. And its focus was around 45 oil paintings, original oil paintings done by a South Texas painter by the name of Noe Perez. We brought in 2 other authors, Ron Tyler, who was one time the executive director of the Texas Historical Association, a professor at the University of Texas, the curator of the Amon Carter Museum. He wrote a chapter. Bruce Shackelford, who was a consultant at the Whitty Museum and an authority on Native American and Western culture, wrote a chapter. I wrote a chapter on the history of King's Rancho. And I think that's one of the great books. It was a book that was written. It's a fun book. It's a book of King Ranch's, the art of King Ranch, the culture of King Ranch, the history of King Ranch, and how it affected the world. And I think it's one of the great books that's been written. I'm going to brag on what we did, but I think it's one of the great. But it came out. Texas A&M Press published it 2 years ago, and it's been very successful. That's King Ranch: A Legacy in Art. So we're here to do that. There have been a lot of books that have been written that are I call them unauthorized books that were not really authorized by King Ranch, and there's some that are good and some that could have been better if they had sought our participation with maybe helping them with some of the facts and figures. But I think Helenita's book, Janelle's book, Tom Lee's book, and our book that we just produced is probably a pretty good place to start. And if you read through those and look at the photographs and look at the paintings and look at the landscape and you don't understand King Ranch, then you better go back and read them again, because that'll pretty well tell you where we are. What's left out is the modern years of King Ranch. And I wrote in my introduction to the book that we did, I wrote the modern story of King Ranch is yet to be written, because the innovations and creativity of King Ranch continues on. What's happened since 2000 going forward, it would look to most people like what a 100-year-old ranch had done in 100 years rather than just in the 25 years. It's pretty remarkable. The family's still engaged and still inventive and still progressing. They're breeding up their cattle, they're breeding up their horses. They're taking care of their land. They're taking care of their people. They're doing the same thing that Captain King did 170 years ago. But there's a modern story to be told, and it's going to be told at some time. Probably not by me. Like I told you before, I dig up ghosts, That's my contribution to King Ranch is the old years, the first 125 years.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Bob Canan for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about the King Ranch at kingranch.com. I'd like to thank the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas for sponsoring this episode. You can find out more about the National Ranching Heritage Center at ranchingheritage.org. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, and Scott Anderson, for their support of this episode. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.